You've probably never heard of this woman before, but Trong My Lan might just be the most prolific thief in the history of the world. And that's saying a lot. She rose from nothing to become one of the most powerful people in Vietnam, controlling an empire of real estate holdings, businesses, and banks. But her story is kind of like the ultimate cautionary tale. She took white-collar crime to new heights, and I mean like astronomical heights. She's been convicted of fraud to the tune of $12.5 billion. That's 3% of Vietnam's entire GDP. And now, she's sentenced to death.
A billionaire property tycoon in Vietnam was sentenced to death on Thursday in the country's biggest ever case of financial fraud. Trong My Lan was found guilty of her role in the scam, siphoning $12.5 billion off of Vietnam's largest bank.
But the death sentence might be a bluff by the government. A bluff to get Lan to cough up more dirt on co-conspirators and to get her to cough up information about where exactly all that money went. But this story goes much deeper than one woman committing massive fraud. It's about widespread corruption, about mafia ties, dirty politics, and a controversial campaign trying to fix it. But even deeper than all that, it's a story about a nation that's been grappling with its identity ever since it was torn apart and put back together after a series of devastating wars.
The war in Vietnam. Since I took office 4 months ago, nothing has taken so much of my time and energy as the search for a way to bring lasting peace to Vietnam. I know that some believe that I should have ended the war immediately after the inauguration by simply ordering our forces home from Vietnam. This would have been an easy thing to do. It might have been a popular thing to do. But I would have betrayed my solemn responsibility as President of the United States if I had done so.
This is the story of Trong My Lan, and the story of Vietnam, and the story of just how far a communist government will go in its quest to become a capitalist powerhouse. Trong My Lan comes from humble beginnings. She grew up in a Chinese-Vietnamese family in Ho Chi Minh City and sold cosmetics at a market stall with her mom when she was young. By the 90s, she owned a whole collection of hotels and restaurants. So how'd she go from a market vendor hawking cosmetics to owning multiple properties? The details are a little murky here, but we do know that in 1992, she married Eric Chu Nap Ky, a wealthy Hong Kong businessman with loads of real estate connections. That same year, Lan founded a company called Van T Phat Group, a real estate holdings company. The company owns properties in some of the most sought-after places in Ho Chi Minh City. There are luxury hotels like the Windsor Plaza Hotel and the Sherwood Residence, restaurants like Duc Bao and Hu Ni, and residential high-rises among a whole fat portfolio of other holdings. Lan has basically become the boss of real estate in Vietnam. The thing is, though, in Vietnam, all land is officially state-owned. You need to have government connections for access to it, to develop it, to build these bougie hotels and restaurants on them. Lan and her husband certainly had these connections. The Van T Phat Group grew into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, with over 1,000 businesses under its umbrella and a whole network of ghost companies with international connections. In 2011, using her government connections, Lan merged 3 struggling banks into one mega bank, the Saigon Commercial Bank. Here's where the real embezzlement starts. Vietnamese law officially states that one person can't own more than 5% of the shares of a single bank. By 2023, Trong My Lan owned 90% of the shares of Saigon Commercial Bank. 90%! Between 2012 and 2022, Lan embezzled over $27 billion and funneled them through shell companies via her Van T Phat Group. At one point, towards the end of her spree between 2019 and 2022, her personal taxi driver would just drive up to Saigon Commercial Bank branches and withdraw cash, $4 billion in total, and then storing it in boxes in her basement. All that cash, even if it were in Vietnam's largest denomination banknotes, would weigh over 2 tons. How'd she do it? Bribes, of course. Lots of bribes. Dozens, if not hundreds of bribes. She bribed banking system inspectors, including the Deputy Inspector General overseeing the whole system, paying him $500,000. Do Thi Nan, the head of Vietnam's central bank's inspection team, received $5.2 million in cash. The payout was given to her in 3 styrofoam boxes. Styrofoam boxes, because why not make bribery as shady as possible? I'm surprised bribe money wasn't written in a Sharpie on the side of them. For years, Lan was able to operate this scheme undetected because of the protective umbrella provided by her main patron, an extremely powerful member of the Communist Party's Politburo who ruled Ho Chi Minh City like his own personal fiefdom. As party chief there and one of the top 15 leaders nationwide, he shielded Lan from scrutiny. Who was this guy? Ly Tan Hai, It was basically an open secret that he was incredibly corrupt, and he was forced to resign in 2015, although it was all kind of covered up and made to look like he just hadn't been reelected and instead retired. He avoided jail time, but it looks like he may now be in the crosshairs. His successor wasn't much cleaner. Dinh La Thang is serving a 30-year prison sentence for embezzling around $34 million while he was the chairman of Vietnam Oil and Gas Group.
Tôi xin khẳng định lại một lần nữa về quan điểm của tôi đối với bản cáo trạng là hoàn toàn không thay đổi.
So, okay, we're talking about high-spread corruption at the highest levels of government here. How did we get here? How was this one woman really able to embezzle 3% of Vietnam's entire GDP? To answer that, we have to go back in time.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
2 years later, South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam, and the country is reunited under communist rule. And by the way, saying reunited isn't exactly an accurate word to describe what happened in the first place. The U.S. narrative that it entered the war to save a capitalist democracy from a communist threat isn't exactly true. In the 50s, the Vietnamese were fighting against French colonial rule. In the aftermath of that war, a war that the Vietnamese won, the French and its allies held on to power in the South.
August 1945. After 80 years of colonial rule and 4 years of Japanese occupation, a new surge for independence sweeps French Indochina. As French troops return to Hanoi and to Saigon, symbol of France's Eastern Empire, European citizens welcome them.
The Geneva Convention in 1954 ended up splitting the country in two, a country that would have voted overwhelmingly for the Communist Party. The U.S., led by a CIA agent named Edward Lansdale, then installed a pro-American Catholic named Ngo Dinh Diem as president in the South, pitting him against Ho Chi Minh and his Communist Party in the North. So in a way, you can say the entire North-South tension and the resulting civil war was actually manufactured by the West.
But many Vietnamese support a new nationalist government that claims most of Indochina. At the head of it, a hero of wartime resistance, Ho Chi Minh. At 55, Ho has become a legend. A communist, although many of his followers are not, Ho, trained in Moscow, educated in Paris, follows a pure nationalist line. He tells the French, "We want to govern ourselves, but we need your engineers and your capital."
Then the Vietnam War happens, or as many Vietnamese call it, the American War, or as the Vietnamese government officially calls it, the resistance war against America to save the nation. We all know what goes down next.
Near the bridge, the men of B Battery, 320th Artillery, prepare for another firing mission. Throughout the morning, they have rained howitzer shells upon the enemy forces attacking the camp. Now, with fresh supplies of ammunition, they're ready to begin again.
When the war ended, Vietnam was in ruins. The U.S. dropped more explosives on Vietnam than the Allies used on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. 5 million hectares of forest were burned to the ground. Unexploded shells and landmines sat waiting for civilians to put a foot in the wrong place. There were 10 million refugees, 1 million war widows, and 3 million people without jobs. There was an opioid epidemic. Orphans roamed the streets. Inflation was running at 900%. The country was literally full of rice paddies, but with no one to farm them, the government had to import rice. Then you had the fact that the U.S. promised over $3 billion in aid during the Paris peace talks and didn't end up paying a cent to help the rebuild. The American government actually imposed a trade embargo and actively petitioned agencies like the International Monetary Fund, UNESCO, and the World Bank to deny Vietnam any form of aid. This was actually tied to an ongoing beef the U.S. had with Vietnam about disclosing the fate of hundreds of missing American POWs. And it was a whole long, drawn-out beef, too. I mean, check out the text of this proposed bill from 1993. China had agreed to keep a number of American POW MIAs for North Vietnam. In China? We don't have time to get into that right now, but let us know in the comments if we should dive into that story in a separate video. Anyway, throughout the 70s, the Vietnamese government, which was and still is a one-party state, tried its best to uphold its socialist communist ideals. But it was an exercise in futility. It tried a crude kind of Soviet model where it forced farmers to cough up their crops in exchange for ration cards. But there was no incentive to work, and the economy was as bad as it had been right after the war ended. So, in the early 80s, The government pivoted. It started letting farmers sell their surpluses. By the late 80s, it was running an official policy of market economy with socialist orientation, called the Doi Moi reforms. Capitalism was starting to seep into Vietnam, and the U.S. was thrilled. Then something big happened.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Soviet Union collapsed, and the entire world kind of saw how broken its economic model really was. In 1994, the U.S. lifted the embargo. International aid started pouring in. Vietnam became one of the world's leading exporters of rice. Poverty went from 70% when the war ended to 32% by 2000. Nowhere in Vietnam are the effects of this transition clearer than on this street. This is Dong Quoy Street in downtown Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon. Here you can buy $500 t-shirts, $15,000 Versace watches, and dine at Le Bourgeois restaurant, where a meal can cost the equivalent of a week's pay for the average Vietnamese worker. But here's the thing with Dong Quoy Street, and the thing with this miraculous Vietnamese rebirth under its new capitalist communist hybrid system. The people with the connections got richer while your average Vietnamese citizens didn't. Let's go back to the turn of the 21st century again. At this point, leaders in Vietnam were at a crossroads. We can see it in this leaked cable from April 2000 by an American insider analyzing the situation. From their own perspective, the Communist Party leaders of Vietnam faced a profound economic dilemma: how to open up the economy and benefit from increased trade and investment without risking loss of social stability and the potential loss of their monopoly on power. How did these Communist Party leaders solve this dilemma? Widespread graft and corruption. That's how. Vietnam became one of the most corrupt countries in the world. When the government started selling state-owned companies, people with government connections started gobbling them up in the same way the Russian oligarchs gobbled up the remains of the Soviet Union. And the scale of this corruption is mind-boggling. One estimate says that for every $10 spent on a public project, $7 goes into someone's pocket. Now, grade school math tells you that means 70% of Vietnam's entire state budget is being stolen. Here's another leaked cable, this one from 2006. It mentions something called the PMU-18 scandal. The PMU-18 stands for Project Management Unit 18. It's a government bureau responsible for building roads and other infrastructure projects. It came to light that the bureau's executive director, Bui Tianzhong, had embezzled nearly $2 million to run a soccer gambling ring. It made headlines both internationally and within Vietnam, a rare case of media coverage in the one-party state where the government has a stranglehold on most news outlets. But then it went away. The officials involved were given a slap on the wrist, and that was that, despite this other leaked cable from 2006, which stated that the Deputy Prime Minister gave assurances that the government of Vietnam would get to the bottom of this scandal. Except that scandal was only the tip of a huge corruption iceberg in Vietnam. Not only big construction contracts, but every single other transaction Vietnamese people conduct with their government, including medical treatment, land transactions, business licenses, school registration, and above all, traffic enforcement, involves paying bribes of various sizes. In 2005, Vietnam was tied with countries like Eritrea and Palestine in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. And here, scroll down a little further, and we find that a survey found that more than 40% of the civil servants polled admitted to taking bribes. More than 60% of the Vietnamese people reported having to pay bribes. 90% of people figured construction and land agencies were corrupt. I mean, these numbers are just ridiculous. So this is the mess that Trong My Lan was born into, and eventually it all caught up with her, thanks in large part to a guy named Nguyen Phu Trong, the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Trong is hell-bent on weeding out corruption in Vietnam. Since 2016, he's been spearheading a campaign called Blazing Furnace. Over 200,000 party members have been fired, dismissed from the party, or thrown in jail. 2 presidents and 2 deputy prime ministers have been forced to resign. Trong My Lan's trial was a spectacle. She and 85 co-conspirators involved in a decade-long graft were put in the spotlight for everyone to see. There was a literal tower of evidence against her, 2,500 files in 104 boxes that weighed a total of 6 tons. That's about the weight of an adult male African elephant, by the way, the largest land animal on Earth. There were so many documents that they had to be given their own separate room. The People's Court of Ho Chi Minh City even installed special security cameras and fire safety equipment to safeguard them. And on April 11th, Lan was convicted and sentenced to death. But some insiders see this sentence as a bluff, meant to scare her into dishing out more information about where she stashed assets and who else she was in bed with.
It's not unpredicted, but it's I believe it's going to be commuted. But they want to give her a very heavy sentence so that she is willing to give up the information about her other assets, because they still want to recover the assets, many assets from her that they have not been able to. So that's one of the reasons why they hand out a death sentence for her, but it's likely to be commuted later.
Finally, before we wrap this thing up, let's talk about China. China was an ally of communist North Vietnam during the war, and it helped Vietnam rebuild in the years after. But recently, the two have been arguing over territory in the South China Sea. Vietnam has also been beefing up its manufacturing capabilities, and in recent years, it's been looking like a good alternative for countries like the U.S. that want an alternative to Chinese manufacturing. Trong My Lan is Sino-Vietnamese. Her husband is from Hong Kong. They've donated millions of dollars embezzled from Vietnamese banks and businesses to China over the years. They've been business partners with another Hong Kong billionaire named Li Ka-shing, a guy who made a fortune selling plastic flowers, among other things. What does this mean? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe deeper things are happening here that we won't know about until much later. China has its own version of a hybrid communist capitalist one-party state. There are similarities in how both countries began accepting free markets while maintaining a veneer of communism. There might be one big difference, though, and let's end by making this point. The Vietnamese government, the CVP, didn't usher in the Doi Moi, those free market reforms of 1986 that transformed Vietnam from an impoverished Soviet-like shell to a relatively well-off nation. The people did. Here, check this out. It was the Vietnamese who lifted themselves out of poverty, mostly in spite of communist policy. Farmers and workers in state enterprises began engaging in market activities well before 1986. Even as early as the 1960s in North Vietnam, meaning market reform was a bottom-up development, not a top-down transformation imposed by the CVP in 1986. A leaked cable from 2000 echoes this. Among the population at large, Marxist-Leninist ideology has few followers in Vietnam. The average person on the street finds this to be background noise that is irrelevant to their daily life. So what really are the consequences of this whole corruption shakedown in Vietnam? Is the CVP trying to save face and truly reform? Is this the last gasp of a dying government? Will the Vietnamese people look at all this corruption and revolt? How does China factor in? Will Trong My Lan really get the death penalty? The answer to all of the above, right now at least, is we'll just have to see. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and help us continue to take deep dives like this into topics that matter.